Love can be exhilarating and wonderful, but it can also be painful and complicated. Join clinical psychologist and best-selling author Dr. David Hawkins as he reveals the truth about the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of relationships. Listen in as he gives you practical tips for hope and healing. Welcome to the podcast, Mad in Love.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Hawkins, and this is our first podcast of Mad in Love. And joining me today is my esteemed colleague, Sharmen Kimbrough, but more about that in just a moment. Sharmen will introduce you. But first, I want to just share with our listeners a little bit more of what are we doing and why are we doing it. So a little bit about me. I can still recall the excitement I felt when in graduate school, I had the opportunity to work with a really kind of high caliber team of clinicians helping individuals that were in a lot of distress in an inpatient setting down in Portland, Oregon. And that is what started me on the path of being a people helper. And Sharmen, I'm sure you've got your own story about how you got into this, but it was in that setting where we really listened compassionately to people and we gave them clear guidance. We helped them out of very difficult situations and sent them out of that inpatient setting in a better way than we found them. So hurting people were then, and they still are now, looking for really caring direction. And that's what we're going to provide for you in these podcasts, Mad in Love. Those were the early days of learning and intervening in people's lives. And that created in me just an ongoing desire that I haven't lost in 40 years. I'm still excited about doing this work. And that's again why I wanted this podcast, Mad in Love. So I still bring a passion, and you're gonna hear that from Sharmen today too. I bring a passion and compassion, as she does, to hurting people. It's been a gift for me. I feel like I get more than I give when I work with people. Seeing people in desperation over the years has really impacted me. But approximately, I don't know, probably about 10 years ago, I really came to understand that the traditional way of working with couples, the 1 hour a week, you go into the counselor's office for 1 hour a week, you come back a week. Anyway, all of that just seemed woefully inadequate to me, superficial. And I don't know that we really helped couples, especially when it involves ongoing issues of narcissism and emotional abuse, which is what we're going to talk about in many of our podcasts, Mad in Love. So it was probably about 10 years ago that the idea of creating Marriage Recovery Center, it was born. And through countless hours of treatment and reading and writing numerous books and talking about this topic, that I have not lost an interest in finding effective ways to intervene with narcissistic and emotional abuse. And that's what we're dedicated to do at the Marriage Recovery Center. That's why Sharmen Kimbrough has joined me. We're going to talk about narcissistic and emotional abuse and what is it and how do we move beyond that. But that's what we're doing at the Marriage Recovery Center. And we have a broad team, a broad range of education and treatment experience, and that's what we're all about. So on that note, without further ado, let's dive into the topic. And I do want to pause and tell you that this podcast we're going to talk about emotional abuse. We're going to talk about what is it. We're going to talk about what do you do, what are some of the complications, and just all of that. And that's what the Mad in Love podcasts are going to be about, all things related to narcissistic and emotional abuse. So without further ado, let me bring on my colleague, Sharmen Kimbrough. Sharmen, tell us about yourself and what your experience with the Marriage Recovery Center and the topic of emotional and narcissistic abuse. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, you said just a few minutes ago that you had birthed the idea of the Marriage Recovery Center about 10 years ago. And I came to work for you or with you about 7 years ago. So,
Uh-huh.
been in the trenches with you for a while now, just really trying to help people figure out how to find their footing through whatever the situation is that they're dealing with, but particularly within that scope of emotional abuse, narcissism, that kind of thing. So men and women, helping them to find their footing and their heading and a sense of direction and purpose and healing through the mess, no matter what it looks like.
So tell us, I think the topic of emotional abuse, Sharman, is very, very complicated. Very complicated. I was talking to a couple earlier today, and I said to the woman, I think narcissistic and emotional abuse in some ways is more felt than it is seen because it can be so subtle. But how would you even define emotional abuse?
Hmm. It's hard to define it. Yes, I try to put it in a one-liner because I'm a queen of one-liners, I've been told. But my one-liner is that emotional abuse is really insistent, insidious, overpowering other people for the sake of one's own self, one's own
Mm,
benefit at the expense of the people around them. And, like you said, it's hard to define because in actuality, everywhere we go, people
mm,
are self-protective and they're hiding and they're trying to make their way through life in a way that gets them what they want, right? It gets them what they want and keeps them safe. And if they're not paying attention to how they affect the people around them, that means they end up hurting them, right? Because the bigger picture
yeah.
is that you cannot have good relationships while you're in hiding, right? Hiding and self-protection means you're not having good relationships, but we were created for relationships. And so there's always that dichotomy of how real can I be without harming someone, or what do I have to do to protect myself to get what I want and not be harmed?
I, I I really think it's important to emphasize what you said about power and control.
Mm-hmm.
Power and control used from a sense of superiority. You have said, you probably will say again here, that when it comes to emotional abuse, the emotional abuser becomes larger and the victim becomes smaller. There's a power differential. Can you
Mm-hmm.
speak to that power differential?
Yeah, I think, when you're thinking in the context of, someone powering over someone else, a lot of times what's happening is the other person who probably is trying to seek a relationship, wants the relationship. Most often, the context is that the man is the power overer and the woman is the one seeking to comply. Most often, I realize that it goes both ways, but
Mm,
what you see is a woman making herself smaller and smaller, trying to keep him happy. Um, in effect, though, there's nothing she can do to keep him happy. And so eventually she ends up, feeling like a shell of a person who doesn't have her own feelings anymore, besides being numb, can't think anymore, doesn't make decisions anymore, that kind of thing.
in this power differential, Charmin, what I hear from a lot of women is that they try they try so many different ways to make an impact on him, that they're, I think I've heard you say this before, that she and this is a generalization, but typically she is working at trying to create a connection, even in her criticality, even making complaints, even if she, we're going to talk about this more later, but even if she were to explode or do anything, she's really still trying to penetrate. And I'd like you to comment on this piece. She's trying to penetrate his defensive shell. You said that he's very self-protective, I think was your word. what is she trying to do, and what is it with these impenetrable defenses? I guess those are two questions.
So I want to tease that out a little bit farther. I talk a
Sure.
lot in terms of that narcissism and codependency are actually on the same. They're two extremes of the same spectrum. That narcissism is about getting what I want, staying safe, making my way through life by taking and taking and taking from the people around me, right? It's still hiding. It's in hiding. There's a facade that's being presented. It's usually power and control, but it is about controlling other people by taking and using with very little regard to really what it's doing to the other person. Codependency, on the other hand, is also about hiding and controlling, right? But it's about staying safe and getting what I want by giving and giving and giving. It's still hiding. It's presenting a facade, not being real, but in an effort to stay safe and get what I want. Keep him happy so he won't harm me, so to speak. Or keep her happy so she won't spend all my money or whatever it is. But they're two ends of the extreme, right? They're two extreme ends of the same spectrum. That health is something in the middle that requires two things. One, coming out of hiding, which means being real, knowing who you are and where you're going, and being able to collaborate in the context of relationships, because we are created to be interdependent, right? So, typically it is men who do the powering over because we're in a society where we're taught, men are the go-getters. They're the ones that get her done. They're driven by what they can do, right? Whereas women tend to be the more codependent because they're taught their job is to nurture and to lean into relationships, and they're the ones caretaking, right? And so stereotypically, that's kind of where it lands. Although I've met with men who are codependents, I've met with women who are narcissists. The point is, both are maintaining a facade that hides and protects who they really are, because for whatever reason, whatever trauma they've had in their life, they've learned it's up to them to protect themselves and get what they want out of life, right? So I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah. So this issue about hiding, this self-protective, these defenses. Can you speak to? I think the second part I was asking about the impenetrability. It's a big word. The impenetrability. She is trying to make contact with him, even in her complaints, even in all of her energy. She's really trying for connection. And he, in his, you know that I use the word emotional immaturity, that narcissism in many ways is emotional immaturity. So instead of seeing her bid for connection as a bid for connection, he perceives it as a threat to his
offense.
fragile ego. And there it goes again. Then the defenses come up, and then he wounds her even more. She's trying for connection. Speak to that, the trying to penetrate defenses, and the utter it just doesn't work, and she's left even more wounded.
Yeah, I think, again, when people are trying to get what they want out of life and are afraid, maybe not necessarily afraid, but also haven't been taught how to build a connection, when someone is beating down the door, so to speak, to get in, and they're not able, don't know what to do, are afraid, feeling self-protective, instead of leaning into, oh, here's a simple thing we could fix if we could just talk about it, they more naturally lean towards not going to talk about it, but I'm going to, dig my heels in why I'm doing what I'm doing. Because a couple of things I think impact that. Lots of nuances here, but a couple of things. One is free will. Like when people feel coerced to do something. So a woman is trying to, drag a man into a relationship, for example. it kills the desire. It takes away the meaningfulness of it. It ends up destroying it, for example, because there's not that free will piece in there. And yet we act in ways that resist anyone trying to tell us what to do. So both ends of the spectrum feel controlled in so many ways, right? Because there's that dynamic of being told what to do, or just not having their no mean no, right? Because they're immature or whatever it is. So it's impenetrable because there's pride. There's, that pride that says no one's going to tell me what to do. And there's that pride that says I cannot be wrong. And again, I think that goes back to self-protection too. I cannot let anyone see how much of a mess I am inside, whatever the shame is, or whatever the immaturity is, or whatever it is. I can't let anyone see that. So instead of addressing an issue, even simply being able to say, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know where I'm going. Let me stop and ask directions, right? There's something so hard about that makes it so that instead of it becoming something where they're working together on a relationship, they both end up digging in their heels, doing what they're doing. To what end? I don't know. That's why they end up here, because they need us to help them figure out some new steps.
I remember, Sharmen, when you and I did a marriage intensive together, and we've done many, and it's been very interesting for me to think about something you said. And you said, you asked the couple, as I recall, you said, what are you fighting for? And it had a double meaning, of course. Like, why are you not only why are you fighting, but do you have a common goal? And of course, unfortunately, with that couple and with many couples, they weren't working together. Largely, while it can be co-occurring and co-created, many times he, as you've been saying in different ways, he is so self-protective. What he's fighting for is often self-protection, while what she's fighting for is connection. Can you speak to that? That was a great phrase. What are you fighting for? Speak to where they've got different agendas.
I usually use that quote in conjunction with saying, how do you define win, or how do you define what worked? Because that identifies what the goal is. But in reality, most often, like I'll hear people say, I tried that and it didn't work. She'll say, I tried to talk to him and it didn't work. And then I'll immediately say, well, what do you mean by worked? Were you authentic? Did you say what you needed to say? Did you come out of your own hiding to really put some good boundaries down, or whatever it is? And that changes the perspective a little bit. It goes right back to, what are you fighting for? If you're just fighting to be heard, or you're just fighting to make your point, well, that's all good and fine, but it's not going to build a relationship.
Yeah.
Right. And so you've got to be able to be fighting for there really to be understanding, collaboration. I prefer to use collaboration rather than compromise, because while technically there's the same kind of thing, collaboration sounds way more proactive, so way more optimistic. So, what are they doing to collaborate? If they can't get to that point, they don't know what they're fighting for to provide collaboration, well, then we're not building a relationship. So when either one of them, one or the other, is fighting for something that is just about being heard or getting their way or whatever, that just tells us, we need to redirect what we're doing, even in a counseling setting. We need to redirect so that we can get on the same page.
Would you go so far, Sharmen, to say that the astute listener, the pastor, the counselor, whoever, if they're listening astutely, do you think that the astute listener can discern what they are fighting for? Can the discerned counselor, pastor, people helper, can they discern, wow, she's fighting for connection and he's fighting for self-protection? Can that even be a hallmark of, kind of watching what's really happening?
Yeah. And I think it takes paying attention to how both of them are using language. because how they're talking about things tells you where they believe the power and control is and really what they're looking for. So they might not necessarily be speaking out loud what their goal is. But I think for us as people helpers, we can see it. And actually, a lot of the goals are really common. So in dysfunction, the goal is just to be heard and for something
Yeah.
to be changed. But that in and of itself doesn't necessarily lead to connection. And so our role as people helpers is to say, well, that's a good and fine goal to be heard and for things to be changed. But ultimately, we're trying to build a relationship. So how do we get the goal to be not just those two steps to be heard and to have something change, but that goal of how do we actually build a space where the two of you can connect together, not in hiding. Again, healing,
Yeah.
recovery
Yep.
requires authenticity. You have got to be able to see inside each other. And so letting that be a goal. But yeah, back to your question, for people helpers to see that, yeah, we can hear it in their language. Who feels small? Who feels big? What is the point they're trying to get across? And then what is under that? Because most often it's way safer to point to what's not working than it is to ask for what you want to have be different, because that feels vulnerable. But that's the point we need to
Yeah.
get to.
I want to bring up another aspect. You know that I've talked about this and I've thought a lot about it. It's another aspect that I see as part and parcel of emotional abuse. And it really ties in. All of these concepts weave together so nicely. And you're doing a great job, Sharman. You really have a lot of skills with this. And
Thank
I'm
you.
sure those that watch this podcast, listen to the podcast, are going to determine that. Another part and parcel aspect of emotional abuse is failure to take responsibility. Our
Mm,
colleague, this Natalie Hoffman, uh, who writes and speaks a lot about narcissism and emotional abuse, says that emotional abuse is failure. Part of emotional abuse is failure to take responsibility for wrongdoing. What I have said in one of my videos is the inability of a man, and of course it could be a woman, but the inability of a man to sit with healthy shame and healthy remorse. And I'm not talking about being a shameful person, but to sit with that godly sorrow. What
mm-hmm.
role do you think failing to take responsibility for wrongdoing, how does that weave into this topic of emotional abuse and the topic of hiding and so on? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think, being authentic, coming out of hiding does require acknowledging our own depravity, right?
Hmm.
But to acknowledge I've done wrong, it's huge. It's hard. It's huge. I think that's, the number one step of surrender to God is acknowledging our own depravity. And so if there's not
Hmm.
that element in a person's life, imagine how difficult it is to acknowledge that to your spouse one way or another. So there is that piece, but it's in essence, it's kind of that surrender that I am a mess and that's normal.
Hmm.
Do I want to hide in my mess and, put all the responsibility on the other person? Or do I actually want to do something different to learn and to grow, which is our right and our responsibility as human beings to take charge of our life, to learn and to
Hmm.
grow, to mature. A lot of the elements that we're dealing with that we call narcissism and emotional abuse and temper tantrums and all that are really about emotional immaturity. And
Yeah.
immaturity is, it's everyone else's fault. Immaturity is, I get to do whatever I want to do and I don't have to pay anything for it. I don't have to take responsibility. Mom will bail me out or dad will bail me out, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So there is that piece of it there where it's so hard to just acknowledge, to own, I did something here that wasn't healthy. Even if
Yeah.
you're the victim, like as a victim, it's hard to acknowledge that too, because as a victim of emotional abuse, how you respond, even if you respond very poorly in those places, it's a natural response a normal response to abnormal behavior. But normal responses to abnormal behavior are in and of themselves often very abnormal, right? They're dysfunctional. They don't work, but because they're self-protective. So even for both sides to acknowledge who they are and where they're going and just owning their own place in this is really hard. Like, there is a piece there where at the end of the day, I am responsible for who I am, whether it's as the perpetrator or the victim. So I think it's hard either way, because again, we are so self-protective. And then that self-protection puts us acting in ways that are not conducive to building relationships.
Yeah. So I want to shift and talk about something else that we talk about a lot at the Marriage Recovery Center. The topic is boundaries. And I want to just remind everybody, and I know you know this too, Sharmen, that these women have gone to this man in an effort to create connection, in an effort to bring healing to this troubled relationship. She's read all these books. She's signed up for so much counseling. She's worked. She's done what I call over functioning. But I don't fault her for that. That's just a normal response because she's really trying to have this connection. He has defended himself. He's gone into hiding. He flips things back on her and creates this crazy interaction, which leads to, you've heard me say this many, many times, which leads to her getting caught in this emotional quicksand. She tries to work this problem out. She tries to confront him. She tries to work out the problem. And because he won't really own his issues, he won't take responsibility, he flips all this stuff back on her, da-da-da-da. Now, then you bring up this topic, well, she needs to have good, clear, firm boundaries. And I'm telling you, Sharmen, you and I both know she's looking at you and I and going, are you nuts? This is not going to work. I've tried boundaries. And anyway, so please share with us, how in the world do we weave boundaries into this complex, did he say complex? Dynamic. What role do boundaries play in this messy, complex, difficult situation?
Yeah, I have a lot of people say to me, I've never had any boundaries. I don't know how to use boundaries. What is a boundary? That kind of thing. Again, both sides of the fence. They're like, I'm not going to put boundaries in place. But I think it requires really understanding what boundaries are. We like to think of them, we're taught to think of them, I think, as, rules on other people about what those people can do to us. But in reality, that's not a boundary because you can't control the other people. Saying it that way, stating it that way requires that person know your boundary and do what you've asked of them, right? But a boundary is actually more like, I use the analogy of a guardrail. It's more like a guardrail that you use to define the space that you're going to operate within on the road you want to be on. So it requires knowing what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of person, what kind of people do you want to hang out with? What kind of space do you want to be in? And in reality, everyone has been taught boundaries, right? Like, they know when they're around their parents.
I agree with you on that. Say that again. Everybody has been.
Yes, follow me here. Our parents taught us that if we wanted to be around them, if we did not want to get backhanded, there was a certain way we had to talk to them. And so in some regard, that's a rule. But in another regard, that's my parents saying, I am not going to raise children. I'm not going to be in the space of children who are backtalkers. Right? So we were taught boundaries. Elementary school. We hung out with the people we like to hang out with. Because our boundary, whether we thought of it in those terms or not, was, I'm not going to hang out with someone who doesn't treat me nicely. But we didn't go to them and say, I'm only going to hang out with you if you treat me nicely. It was just in our heads. We learned that. but to what extent is the question. So again, bringing it back to the context of the relationships that we work with, I think thinking about a boundary puts a victim in that place to have to own her space or his space, right? And that's hard because it's actually not, it's not a power tool. It's not something now that you use to power over the other person or join the power struggle, right? Which is what it feels like. If I put a boundary, now I'm in this power struggle. If he doesn't honor it or she doesn't honor it, now I have to come up with these consequences. And that's just a power struggle again. But if we think of it in terms of, in actuality, I have to own my space. What do I do to be responsible for how I act, how I talk, who I hang out with, who I make room for, right? So it's just shifting that definition just a little bit to make it a more usable tool and not a weapon in the power struggle.
You just used a really important phrase that I want to make sure everybody catches. You didn't use two words together that I want to put together, and I think you'll buy this. Personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's a difficult concept because my definition, Sharmen, of personal responsibility is I have to own what's happening in my life right now. I am here. This is now. She, he is the way they are. What do I now want to do about this? And it's so easy when you feel victimized. It's so easy to shift into feeling like you have no power, no influence, no, boundaries are he won't honor the boundaries, da 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 da. But I think would you agree with me, the way you counsel women even who have been victimized, you still are saying to them, yeah, but I want to start from a place of personal responsibility. Today is today. This is now. It is the way it is. What do you now want to do about it? Speak to personal responsibility and then boundaries, and then we'll go from there.
So the personal responsibility boils down to that we are not just victims of our circumstances. So yes, we
as
can't
much as
control,
it feels like it.
Exactly. We can't control most of our circumstances. We cannot control them. Like there's most things beyond our control. We do control ourselves. So I get to decide, for example, who I invite over for dinner.
Yeah.
Right? There might be some social norms or some cultural norms or something that, I may feel obliged to lean into. But in reality, I get to decide how much time I give to people that aren't nice to be around. Right? I get to decide that. How much do I want to entrust my heart to this relationship? So that's something I do control, right? I can control, what I do with what I've got to work with. I am not just at the mercy of what someone else decides, my pastor, my family, my spouse, or whatever it is. Like, I'm not just at their mercy. I'm going to answer to God for the decisions I made about me. So even if that is in the context of a lot of things that are dangerous or uncontrollable, there's still a way of moving within them with this analogy that I use with most of my clients as undercover agents in a war zone, which requires knowing who you are, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, knowing how to extricate yourself from very dangerous landmines when and where you need to, but engaging wherever the mission is. What is the mission? To build a relationship, to launch the kids, to do our job well, whatever that is. It may require that there are some things that aren't, like, we can still be vulnerable without showing all our cards, right? So that's what boundaries look like, is knowing what kind of space am I moving within? How do I want to show up in that space? And what do I need to do when it gets dangerous? Or I start to feel like I'm getting pushed off the cliff.
Sharmen, I got to tell you that is incredibly powerful, what you just said. It's incredibly powerful. I want to camp on it for a second. If when you excited me right there. Undercover agents in a war zone.
Mm-hmm.
I often tell the men I'm working with as they're trying to learn new behaviors, I want them to lean into difficult situations, which touches on what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
undercover agents in a war zone. Now, he's not the exact same thing, but I want to teach him this is a mission, man. You you
Mm-hmm.
you get to go home tonight and you get to face a difficult situation and you get to try a new skill and you get da 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 da. And it sounds like you give women that same, you're imparting that same encouragement. You have an opportunity. You're an undercover agent in a war
Mm-hmm.
zone, and this could be a really exciting mission. Is that a fair
Yeah.
way to think about this?
Yes. Ultimately, the word picture that I want for couples is that they are back to back, swords out, fighting an enemy together. Right?
Yeah.
Just that picture. We are on the same team. We are fighting against the same enemy. We're not the enemy to each other.
Hmm.
And so, starting with from an individual standpoint, again, you've got to be a warrior to be someone, to have someone's back well. And so part of the mission is knowing yourself, knowing who you are, where you're going, being steadfast in that, and then being able to talk about it in the context of the relationship too. And again, there's a personal responsibility there. And there's also the collective responsibility, so
Hmm.
to speak, in that, we are married. We're in this marriage, and it's meant to be as this unit fighting an enemy together, where the home is a refuge. The home is the safe no-fly
Yeah.
zone. The home is the safe place. And we have that so upside down because we have the enemy making sure we don't connect and can't be vulnerable because it
Hmm.
feels so unsafe and we don't have the skills to interact. But yes, I'm for both sides. I say step into the hard stuff because at the end of the day, that's what's meaningful. That which is worth having is worth fighting for.
Yeah.
Right. So it's meaningful to step into that, even despite the fear or the immaturity or whatever. That's what life is about, is building things that are meaningful and just going along with the flow, self-protecting ourselves, not connecting with other people. We're going to get the very thing God said was not good. We're going to be alone,
Be alone.
emotionally,
Yeah.
absolutely alone.
I have stolen another tool of yours, Sharman, I must confess. So this is a public confession that another
Okay.
another one of your tools that I love, that I want everybody to grab a hold of, is the if anybody else tool. Let
Mm-hmm.
me set the stage here. Every day when I talk to women that have been emotionally abused, every day, they say this to me. They say, do I really have a right to pull away emotionally? I mean, come on. Do I really have a right to set? I mean, because he's telling me I don't have a right to blank, and so I'm not sure I have the right. And he's telling me this. I mean, I've really sought to make an impact with him, but he's telling me, but he's telling me, but he's telling me, and they really are looking to me, and I'm sure they do this to you. They're seeking validation for, you know what? And one of your tools, the if anybody else tool, I want everybody to grab a hold of this because it's really, it really has sunk in with me. And like I said, I'm using it and people are loving it. Tell us about the
Good.
if anybody else tool.
Yeah, that's just that idea that you wouldn't let anybody else treat you like that, whatever that is, right? So if you are trying to figure out what your boundaries should be, and you look at your spouse and you go, rename them anybody else. So your spouse's new name is anybody else. Makes it easy. If anybody else called me these names, what would I do? Right?
Hmm.
If anybody else yelled at me every time we got in the car, would I
Yeah.
ever get in the car with them again?
Yeah.
If anybody else yelled and screamed every time they were around me, would I be inviting them to dinner? Probably not. And it makes it easier to see how to withdraw, not because it's about punishing the other person, but because that's a natural response. If you're a jerk, nobody wants to hang out with you,
Yeah.
right? That it's a natural response. So it makes it easier to think about, well, what would I do? What should I do?
It's so helpful, Sharman. I've used it in my own thinking and in my own counseling with women. To think through, if I felt crazy in my interactions with anybody else, if I went to any of my friends and brought up a concern and they flipped it back on me, they blame shifted, they minimized, they rationalized, they justified, they defended their actions, they failed to take responsibility. If anybody else did that to me, yeah. Now, you know the caveat here, the rebuttal, the only one piece of rebuttal that I've gotten is, yeah, but this is my mate. This is my spouse.
Mm-hmm.
So, granted, it becomes a little more difficult when we're talking. It's still a powerful tool, and I
Right.
still think we need to use it, but it becomes more difficult when it is your mate, right?
Mm-hmm. There's more to lose. There's more at stake here. But one of the things that we really have to bear in mind is, but where is this marriage going? Right? So you're
Hmm.
holding on to this marriage. What is your spouse offering you? If they're only offering you this much depth in the relationship, this is all the space you can move within because that's, they've defined for you what your limitations are, right? Based on what they're presenting to you, right? So example would be, we have friends. We all have friends that we know. The only thing they know to talk about is their kids and the weather. It's a relationship that only goes as deep as kids and the weather. We can have a lovely, great relationship, but it's not going to have any depth, right?
Yeah.
Which means there's not going to be a lot of fallout, so to speak, if you decide that you just don't have time for just the kids and the weather. You've got to put your energy into other things. That's why it's easier to, not make room for that kind of relationship. In the context of your marriage, on one hand, it can feel like there's a huge amount of fallout, but most of that ends up being our hopes, our dreams, our values, how sacred we hold marriage, that doesn't take into account in actuality what your spouse is offering you. So if your spouse is only offering chaos, no room whatsoever for you to show up and to have space there to talk about things. Because if you can't show up, there's no authenticity, there's no reality, there's no connection. So if you can't show up in that space, there isn't a relationship. So one of the things to work through first is, well, what is your spouse even offering you? If it's just destruction, well, that leads somewhere. How much do you want to entrust your heart to this path of destruction where there is no room to do differently? So still a ton of fallout, but then again, it puts it in the context of what are you fighting for here? You can't make him change. You can't make her change. And if they're insistent on only offering you chaos and destruction, what are you going to do with that?
So I want to shift gears again slightly, Sharman. With these issues that we address at the Marriage Recovery Center, these very complex issues of manipulation, emotional manipulation, emotional immaturity, narcissism, emotional abuse. Another one of the things that women say to me, they say this to me all the time. Are you going to be taken in by him? Are you going to be manipulated? Are you? I don't. I mean, they really approach me, Sharman, and they say, in so many words, I don't know if I trust you to really see and feel what's going on, because he flips it back on her. He's got a rationale for why he does what he does. He's very self-protective, as we've already shared. What if the NPD partner manipulates the therapist? What do we say to her then?
I will often say that yes, he probably will manipulate try to manipulate. He will probably spin the story that makes him look good and you look bad, right? That is a reality. However, I also say, as coaches, as counselors, we can only work with what we're presented, right? So we can't read his mind. We definitely know there's more to the story than we're being told. We know that, and we can poke around and dig. But at the end of the day, it's actually up to the spouse to look at that and decide, do I want to continue entrusting my heart to someone who, when given the best opportunity in the world to change and to find a better way and to create a better connection, still paints the story that they're perfect and I'm not? Like, there again, that actually is presenting no room for there to be collaboration. And so I put the weight of responsibility on that spouse to decide, what do I do with that? But it is hers to decide, because we can't make people change. All we can do is interact with them in the story that they bring to us, knowing there's more there, so we know how to poke around. But at the end of the day, she's the one, or he, right? Like, from both sides, he's the one that sees how their spouse interacts with the counselor, and they get to decide, when given a chance for there to be something different, this is how they use it. What can I do with that? The other thing I say too is manipulation is only successful when the party trying to be manipulated gives up their right to think for themselves and make their own choices. And I can guarantee you that does not happen with me. I do not give up my right to think and make my own decisions about things.
Yes.
Could I be misled? Yes. Could I be deceived? Yes. Abuse thrives because of the capacity to deceive. So I could be deceived. I am not going to be manipulated, however, because I don't have a vested interest in this relationship, other than my job is to help them think through what they have going on. And so it still boils back down to the spouse looking in to say, when given the opportunity for there to be real hope and change, what do they do with it? Because that's telling you what that person is offering to the relationship.
And I think that's so important, Sharmen. And I think I say this to women and to couples. I say, if you show up in counseling again and again and again and again, and if I get a sense from you folks, if you come and really show up in any way, shape, or form, I am going to get a sense about what's going on. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that? That if a couple will show up, you can say to both of them, but you can reassure the woman, we will feel, see, experience emotional manipulation, narcissism, emotional abuse. It will show up in some form or fashion in the counseling. And so we won't be, over time, I don't see us being deceived or confused even. We will see what's happening. Is that right. Your experience?
Yes, because our goal is always to build a context where we can collaborate on building the relationship. So anything getting in the way of collaborating on building the relationship is a problem. It makes it really easy to see where someone's not following through with something, or where there's deception, or like, it makes it really, really clear when the focus is the point. The point is we're trying to build a context where you can collaborate together on what you want this marriage to look like for the two of you to connect and thrive back to back, swords out, fighting the enemy together.
Sharmen, we need another 2 hours, but we don't have it. So I want to bring up one more part in our podcast today. There's so many things. This happens every time you and I talk. We could go in so many different directions, but all about emotional abuse, narcissism, and what it takes. Speak in just a few minutes here about what role does religion play in the healing process. Huge topic, huge opportunity to be abused and misused, but also an opportunity to be used well.
Yeah. So I make the distinguishment between religion and spirituality. I think religion is the doctrine that we follow, the religious practices, the behavior that we follow in order to worship spiritually, to be, just the behavioral aspects of it. But spirituality in and of itself, we are spiritual beings. So whether we think about God or not, or what we think about God, is a part of who we are. So we're driven by our spirituality, whether we think so or not. So it is a piece of it. And I think if we can really dig down deep, the center of our soul is a spiritual thing. If we can dig down deep and work within that space, like, we can get a lot of work done. And that's often the piece of ourselves that we're the most protective about as well. So I think it's different than religion. I don't think that it, when we stand before God, we're not going to give an account to him for what theological approach we took or which doctrine we followed. I think it's all about knowing God and knowing Jesus and loving him and reflecting him more to the world, that kind of things. So in that regard, really being driven by that means, like I said a little bit ago, that starting point of surrender. If you are not surrendered to God, if you do not know God, you cannot love outside of what it benefits yourself, because it requires you being filled by the Holy Spirit to even be able to love without just thinking of it in terms of benefit to yourself.
Yeah.
Right? So it has to start there. Although we have many clients who don't want to talk about God, don't believe God, they have driven away from that in some regard, or they're following other faiths or whatever. And we can still give all kinds of really good, helpful, practical tools to connect. But honestly, at the end of the day, when you're talking about a soul level connection, it does require a conversation about the spirituality and that whole side of it.
Sharmen, as always, thank you for the heart and soul and skill that you bring to working with women and couples. It's so needed. The world needs people like yourself who understand emotional abuse, who understand this complex problem, and can bring light and healing to couples and individuals who are willing to seek it. So thank you so much for being on our first podcast of Mad in Love.
Yes, thank
I
you for having me.
appreciate you. All right.
Thanks.
Well, this is a sampling of what we're about and what we're going to offer you in the days and weeks and years ahead in Mad in Love. So please tune in and send us your comments and your thoughts. Our next podcast is going to be emotional abuse and financial control. An incredibly important topic. And our guest speaker is going to be Lee Kaufman, who is a coach at the Marriage Recovery Center. And if you tune in and subscribe, you will be able to hear that podcast and learn from Lee's extensive experience in the realm of emotional abuse and in the realm of finances and how those issues get convoluted and misused. So please tune into that. If any of this resonates with you, please book a time to talk to my team and discuss how you can get started. You can contact the Marriage Recovery Center and our client care team. You can click the button at the bottom of the screen to subscribe, and you'll be notified of the new podcasts that will be coming out on a regular basis. So again, we want to thank you. Without you, this wouldn't be happening. So thank you so much for tuning in, and God bless.